My stepmother abandoned my father when he was dying, leaving his 6-year-old son with me. Now, 3 years later, she's coming back, bringing a gift from me. My parents divorced when I was just 6 years old. They fought all the time, and it was clear they weren't happy in their marriage, taking out their frustrations on each other. Although they were never physically violent, their loud arguments and verbal abuse left an emotional scar on me. My happy place was school. I loved going there and seeing other kids sitting happily, talking about their lives while I was scared to go home. My mom constantly complained to me about how much she hated her life with us. She was a housewife, and after doing all the house chores, she would sit on the couch for hours watching TV. Looking back, I think my mom was suffering from depression. She barely got off the couch unless she needed to use the bathroom. She didn't even bother checking if I had lunch after school. Since my school was just a block away, the other moms would pick us up and drop us off together. My mom stayed on the couch until it was time to cook dinner. Even though my mom did her best, she wasn't a great cook. Sometimes, her dishes had too much salt or none at all. As you can imagine, my dad didn't like this, just like me. The arguments would usually start if my dad brought takeout. Not always, but sometimes, and my mom would get furious, saying she could cook better than all those dirty people at the restaurants and accusing him of wasting money. The arguments would quickly escalate to insults about each other's families and insecurities. My dad would call my mom a potato for sitting on the couch all day, and my mom would mock my dad for not earning enough. This was basically my childhood until they divorced. I was actually happy when they separated, and I wasn't even upset when they told me one night at dinner. However, my lack of emotion really angered my mom. She started wondering if I was a psychopath for not having emotions, and when I explained that I did feel things but was happy about their decision to separate, she started yelling. She accused me of being as selfish as my dad and not caring about her. She vented, saying no one in the family loved or respected her and that she was tired of all of us. Her accusations came out of nowhere, and I couldn't understand what I had done to deserve her anger. During the divorce and custody battle, my mom was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression after a psychological evaluation due to her increasingly frequent mood swings. It was determined that she wasn't fit to be a mother, so my dad got full custody. The judge told my parents that if she ever changed her life with the right medication and got a job, she could have a chance to regain custody in the future. Until then, I would be my dad's sole responsibility. My dad and I moved to a small apartment near his work, which was much farther from my school, so I had to take a school bus to get there. The place wasn't great, and the neighbors were too noisy, but my dad reassured me that it was just temporary and that he would take extra shifts to make sure he could give me a better life. True to his word, within a year, we moved to a much better place. That's when my dad met my stepmother, Stephanie, or Stephanie Osted, as she liked to be called. She seemed like a wonderful person. She was our neighbor and had 2 dogs, which I loved. Every time she came over to visit my dad, I got to play with her dogs. Slowly, day by day, I saw how my dad and Stephanie grew closer. During this time, she was very respectful towards me and mostly stayed out of my way. However, things started to change when she began spending some nights at our house. Suddenly, she had problems with me watching TV after finishing my homework, complaining that I wasn't helping my dad with the dishes or cooking my own meals. You have to understand, I was only 8 years old at the time. I know kids should be taught independence early, but I felt 8 was too young. I could barely reach the kitchen counter, yet she forced me to wash my own dishes and yelled at me if I forgot. I wish my dad had noticed these warning signs and avoided her, but he was clearly infatuated with her. Maybe it was because he'd been alone for so long. When Stephanie finally moved in with all her dogs, she told me I had to move out of my room because the dogs needed a place to sleep. My dad and I were both shocked that she even suggested such a thing. My dad tried to reason with her, explaining that this was my room and there was no reason the dogs couldn't sleep in the living room or even in their room during naps. But Stephanie insisted the dogs needed their own space since she had always given them a whole room. She told me it would be fun for me to live in the cupboard under the stairs. I threw a tantrum and started crying because I was terrified of living in such a dark space. This led to an argument between my dad and Stephanie, and she started threatening to move out. My dad told her that her demand was ridiculous, so they came to a compromise. He would build a small house for the dogs in the backyard. Stephanie agreed, but she was clearly upset with me for not giving in to her demands. After that, she wouldn't let me play with her dogs, and she yelled at me whenever they came near. I noticed that right after she moved in, Stephanie quit her job. I don't know if my dad and she ever had a conversation about it, but she never went back to work after moving in with us. I guess this gave her too much free time to complain about me or find reasons to be upset with me. I think she saw me as an unwanted object in my dad's life and constantly asked why my mom had abandoned me or why I couldn't just live with her instead. My mom hadn't even contacted me once since the divorce, nor did she show any interest in reaching out. Stephanie started finding more reasons to complain about me to my dad. She had issues if I didn't clean my room to her standards, or if I stayed out a little late with my neighborhood friends on the weekend. Every time my dad and I watched a Disney movie, because he knew how much I loved them, she would join us but then try to convince my dad to buy tickets for another movie at the box office. My dad never did, which I guess upset her even more. If you're wondering why my dad was with a woman like her, it was because, aside from her complaints about me, he and Stephanie had a loving relationship. They made a solid couple, but I don't know what it was about me that made her so angry. When I turned 11, according to Stephanie, I was too quiet and too introverted for my age. She would constantly complain about how embarrassing it was that I wasn't popular in school. She also went on about how popular she used to be because she was a cheerleader. Stephanie also had issues with me sleeping too much on weekends and not helping enough around the house. I tried my best to improve. Whenever I could, I set alarms to wake up earlier to get ready for school on time, or wake up early on weekends to help wash the dishes, walk her dogs, or literally offer to help with anything she wanted. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. She would always find something to criticize. Her negative words started to affect me so much that I began to feel anxiety around her for no reason at all. To give you an idea of how much it affected me, during the worst moments of my anxiety, the critical voice in my head sounded just like hers. It was that bad for years. Once, she accused me of being very selfish because I ate too much at a family event. Stephanie had invited her parents and family for a barbecue, and I had just come home from playing basketball with my friends, probably very hungry like any other teenager. She pulled me aside and told me it was selfish of me to eat so much when it wasn't even for me in the first place. I pointed out that my dad had bought all the food, but she angrily whispered that I was being a bad stepdaughter and shouldn't embarrass her in front of her family by eating so much. As I got older, Stephanie started assigning me more and more tasks. Even if I had spent the entire day doing homework and was exhausted, she expected me to cook every Wednesday for all three of us. Every day I was also expected to take out the trash. She even asked me to clean the stove. No matter what I did, she always complained to my dad that I didn't clean like she wanted, or that I didn't know how. However, when it was her turn to clean, she would overlook any problems. When I started swimming classes, she accused me of wasting my dad's money and called me a spoiled child. She told my dad that the money could be better spent on something else. One time when her dogs got sick, she asked my dad to pay for their treatment, telling him that if he could pay for my stupid swimming lessons, he could also pay for her dog's vet bill. My dad refused, and she had to borrow money from her parents in the end. When I turned 13, my dad and Stephanie told me they were expecting a baby. It was a shock for me, but they both seemed incredibly happy. My dad told me that Stephanie had proposed and that they would marry before the baby arrived because it was the right thing to do. I remember feeling numb because I hated this decision and wanted to yell at my dad for getting into another horrible marriage. But they were adults, and it was their decision. What could I do as a 13-year-old? My dad and Stephanie had a quick courthouse wedding, with their parents and me as witnesses. For their honeymoon, Stephanie insisted that my dad take her to Lake Tahoe, so I stayed with her parents for a week. Stephanie's parents were just as unpleasant as she was. They asked me invasive questions about my mother, then commented that maybe I was just as flawed as my mom because of her mental illness, and how I should feel lucky that Stephanie decided to marry my dad, even with a daughter like me. Somehow, they made me feel inferior, like I was worthless. In the following months, Stephanie gave birth to a baby boy. From the moment I laid eyes on Paul, he was my brother. I never felt any resentment toward him for being the new child in the family. I had been alone for so long, so having a brother felt comforting. Paul was born prematurely, and my dad would tell me how he had colic, so sometimes he would cry all night. My dad stayed up all night taking care of him and only slept late in the morning. Then, Stephanie would take over. When I came home from school, Stephanie would leave her baby with me and ask me to feed him or change his diaper if he started crying. I know my dad and Stephanie were exhausted, but she treated me like a nanny and expected me to spend time caring for her baby, even when I had homework to finish or friends to hang out with. If I made plans with my friends to go to a movie or on a trip, she would scold me for being selfish and not helping the family. However, my dad never treated me like that. He actually encouraged me to live my life normally. Once, when my dad went on a work trip for 3 days, my situation with Stephanie got worse. She expected me to care for Paul even at night and would yell at me if he cried too much. She told me that as a woman, I needed to learn how to care for a child or no man would want to marry me. She taught me how to warm his milk, check the temperature of the bottle, make him burp, and bathe him. If Paul cried, she would yell at me to go check on him, as if I were his mother and not her. When my dad came back, I broke down and told him everything because I was so tired and exhausted. He and Stephanie had a screaming match, and he warned her not to use me like that. He told her that if she felt tired, I could help her more, but she didn't like that. She told my dad that she didn't like being a mother, and that this situation wasn't for her. She packed her bags and left. My dad spent weeks begging her to come back because he had to take time off work to care for Paul. Stephanie's parents also scolded my dad for defending me, saying that every family expects the older daughter to help the mother with the younger child, and that it was just tradition. I don't know why, but maybe my dad got tired of everything or just decided to stay silent because he felt helpless. When Stephanie finally decided to come back, she no longer cared if I took care of Paul. She started having him sleep by my side so she wouldn't be disturbed at night. If I had plans with friends, she would make me cancel them or threaten to take my phone away. When Paul started crawling, she expected me to child-proof my room so her son wouldn't get hurt. I think for the first time during all of this, I started to resent my dad. He no longer defended me and let everything happen just to save his marriage. He knew I would be home late on purpose to avoid hearing me complain about Stephanie. Stephanie also started going out drinking with her friends, coming home drunk and passing out before even reaching the bedroom. I knew I had to work hard to eventually leave this house and get some independence, so that's exactly what I did. I kept my head down, focused on my studies, and made sure to get good grades. But then, she started shouting at me, saying I needed to find a nearby university and that family should come before my education. I refused and moved into the university dorm. Since then, my contact with Stephanie and my dad became much less frequent. Stephanie stopped talking to me altogether because she didn't like that I was leaving and not helping her with Paul. Meanwhile, my dad was tired of being the mediator between us. I focused on my university life and made new friends. In my second year one afternoon, my dad called me 23 times. I was with my friends, and my phone was on silent, so I didn't notice the calls. However, when I got home, I immediately called him back. My dad answered, and I could hear a lot of shouting and glass breaking in the background. I asked if he was okay, and he sounded muffled. I got worried and asked if something had happened. That's when my dad told me he had stomach cancer. When I got to my dad's house, I found out that Stephanie had actually left him. But that wasn't all. She had left Paul with my dad. Can you imagine leaving your child with your dying husband? I felt so bad for Paul, as he looked terrified. I hugged him and gave him some cookies while I talked to my dad. He kept repeating that Stephanie had told him she didn't want to be with a dying man. But what made me furious was that she left her 6-year-old son as if he were nothing. I knew exactly how a 6-year-old felt when his whole world was turned upside down. I couldn't understand why Stephanie didn't take Paul with her if she was leaving my dad just because he had cancer. Something didn't make sense, and I felt like it had more to do with her not enjoying motherhood. Now, she had found an easy excuse to abandon her son. I tried contacting her and her parents several times, but no one answered my calls. I could have driven to see them in person, but I didn't want to waste precious time with my dad. I wanted to spend time with him. And honestly, I also loved spending time with Paul. I took care of both my dad and Paul, and this continued for a few weeks. I accompanied my dad to all his doctor's appointments while he went through chemotherapy. Since I had to go back to university, I decided to admit my dad to a cancer treatment center, as he needed 24-hour care. I had no choice but to take Paul to Stephanie's parents' house, since I didn't know what else to do. When they opened the door, they were shocked to see me standing there with Paul, and they asked me what I was doing there. I was so angry that I confronted them about their daughter just running away, leaving Paul and my dad without giving them any reason. Her parents were very reluctant to say anything, but I kept yelling at them. That's when Stephanie finally came out of her room. I was shocked that this woman, who had been living right there, had been ignoring all my calls. Stephanie asked me to stop yelling at her parents and threatened to call the police. I swear, if Paul hadn't been there, I would have charged at Stephanie and hit her right then. I told her that I didn't care about her reasons for leaving my dad, but she needed to take care of her son. Stephanie started refusing, saying that Paul was my brother, so I should take care of him since I was already there looking after my dad. I took a deep breath to calm myself down and told her that my dad was in a cancer treatment center and that I would be going back to university. So, unless she wanted me to call social services, Paul would stay with her. I kissed Paul, said goodbye, and my heart broke for him, but I had no other option at that moment. I did everything I could to focus on my studies in the best way possible because I hoped to get a good job to support my dad if he recovered and to support Paul if needed. It's hard for me to write this, but unfortunately, my dad didn't survive for long. We talked every day, and he told me how he was improving, but clearly he wasn't. Throughout all of this, Stephanie never reached out. She didn't even allow Paul to visit his dad. I tried calling her, but as usual, she ignored my calls, as if I meant nothing to her. 2 months later, the doctors informed me that my dad had passed away in his sleep during the early morning hours. I had to go home and make all the funeral arrangements. For the first time in my life, I felt completely alone, with no one. At my dad's funeral, Paul came with Stephanie's parents, but Stephanie was nowhere to be seen. He saw me and ran to hug me. I collapsed on his tiny shoulders because, literally, he was all I had left in this world to call family. After the funeral, Stephanie's parents told me that Stephanie had decided to leave that morning. I asked them what they meant, and they explained that they had found out in recent months that Stephanie had been having an affair with one of her ex-boyfriends throughout the entire time she was married to my dad. Her parents said that she had wanted to leave my dad for a long time, after realizing that motherhood wasn't for her, but she had been delaying it. Now, with him having cancer, she finally found a reason to leave. I asked them why they were telling me all this, when they should have stopped Stephanie. But her parents went on saying that since Stephanie didn't want Paul, they wanted me to adopt him. I stared at them for a moment because my mind was confused, still processing the pain of losing my dad. They tried to apologize, assuring me they could take care of Paul whenever I needed, but since they were too old and had health issues, they couldn't care for him full time. So they wanted me to adopt him. At first I refused and told them we should call the police and social services right then. But they told me that even if social services were called, they wouldn't be able to do much, and Paul could end up in the system. They tried to guilt trip me, saying that I was all Paul had left and that I was the only one who could help him. Maybe it was because I had lost the only family member I had, but I knew in my heart that I couldn't abandon Paul. So, the day I lost my dad, I realized I would have to start taking care of my half-brother. I wish I could say it was easy, but it wasn't. I had to take a year off from university because there was no way I could handle everything along with my studies. My professors were really disappointed because I had been an outstanding student, but they all understood my situation. Fortunately for us, my dad had left everything to my name, so I worked on selling his house and his car to have the resources to support both Paul and myself. I wanted to leave the city behind and take Paul with me. He was sad to leave his friends, but he was also excited to go to a new city with me. Paul trusted me completely and knew I would take care of him no matter what. Stephanie's parents didn't care that we were leaving the city. Paul and I lived in a small apartment near my university campus, and I enrolled him in a nearby school. I wish I could say the next few years were easy, but they weren't. Over the next 3 years, I balanced my responsibilities as a university student and a tutor to Paul. It was difficult to juggle studies, work, and parenting, but seeing Paul thrive and grow made it all worth it. I also applied for legal guardianship of him, since his mother had clearly abandoned him and his grandparents weren't in good health. There was no doubt that I would be his legal guardian. I had done everything I could to take care of him, so it was a natural transition for me to become his legal guardian. The process wasn't easy. It involved paperwork and legal consultations, but I was determined to go through it all just for Paul. In the end, I was granted legal guardianship. Through all the hardships, our small apartment slowly started to feel like home. Paul adapted well to his new school, made friends, and excelled academically. I kept working hard, knowing that every effort I made was for Paul's future. Eventually, I got a good job after graduation, and we were able to move to a better neighborhood in the city. Paul became a confident, happy child, and I couldn't be prouder of the young person he was becoming. He remembers Stephanie, and sometimes mentions her, but he also understands that I'm his real family. We talk about Dad all the time because I want him to remember him. About a week ago, I received a call from Stephanie's parents. Sometimes they demanded to know where I sold my dad's house and where Paul was living. I told them that Paul was living with me because I would never have abandoned him like she did, and that she couldn't come near him. Stephanie started saying that she knew I was Paul's legal guardian, but that didn't mean, as his biological mother, she couldn't know where he was. She threatened to go to the police if I didn't tell her. I laughed when I heard this, and calmly explained that she was free to do whatever she wanted, but since I had been appointed by the courts to care for him, I wouldn't hesitate to get a restraining order against her. I told her she was the worst mother in the world for abandoning her own child, and she was lucky that I loved Paul so much that I had intervened. Otherwise, God knows where he would be now. Stephanie's voice cracked, and she started crying. She said she was sorry for what she had done, but that she was also going through her own grief, so I shouldn't blame her. I told her not to call me again, because both Paul and I wanted nothing to do with her, and I hung up. After the call, I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and relief. Anger at Stephanie for causing so much pain and disruption in our lives, sadness for the loss of my dad and the struggles we faced, and relief that Paul and I had managed to overcome these challenges together. However, since then, I've felt a little guilty and wondered if others have gone through something similar and what they did in that situation. Am I the bad one for keeping Paul away from his biological mother? Update 1. When I first posted this, I didn't expect to receive thousands of comments. Thank you all for sharing your suggestions and feedback. It has been moving to hear from so many others who, like me, are older siblings and have faced similar challenges. Their stories have made me feel understood, and I truly appreciate every one of you for reaching out. I've listened to all of you, and I'm glad most agree that I should keep Paul away from Steph. I will also start documenting our conversations in case she decides to go to the police or if something else arises, though I know it won't have any legal basis. I also had a conversation with Paul about his mom trying to contact him, and we've agreed on how to move forward. A lot of you have been asking for an update, so here it is. This is the email I sent to Steph and her parents about Paul, just as some of you advised. Email to Steph and her parents. Hello, Steph. I'm writing to inform you about Paul's well-being and his current living situation since you contacted me. As you know, I've been legally appointed as Paul's guardian, as I've been taking care of him for the past 3 years since you abandoned him, and your parents refused to take responsibility. I have assumed the role of providing for Paul and ensuring his safety and happiness. Paul currently lives with me in this city, where I've enrolled him in a nearby school. He's thriving academically and socially, making friends and adjusting well to his new environment. I want to assure you that Paul is in good hands and receiving the care and attention he deserves. I understand you may have concerns or questions about Paul's upbringing. However, since you chose to leave his life the day our father passed away without any explanation, I believe you've lost the right to request any updates. I am open to keeping communication only with his grandparents, as I must prioritize his security and stability above all else. Therefore, I hope you will no longer disturb us. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation. I hope this email finally puts an end to Steph's interference in our lives. Update 2. It's been 3 months since my last update, and I want to reassure everyone that Paul is still with me, as expected. Steph never took any action after my email, and her parents called to inform me that she had left again. They also filled me in on why she called out of the blue. It turns out the ex-boyfriend she left us for had dumped her, and now she's engaged to someone else. So Steph thought it would be perfectly fine to come back into our lives and act as if nothing had happened. Her parents assured me that Steph wouldn't take legal action after abandoning her own son, and they were fed up with her behavior. They assured me they would support my decision and continue to check on Paul's well-being. By the way, Paul is doing well at school. He recently celebrated his birthday with his friends and has started learning how to skate. I've been working hard to provide for us and ensure Paul has everything he needs to grow and succeed in his future. It's not always easy, but seeing Paul's smile and hearing his laughter makes every challenge worth it. Update 3. Something unexpected happened recently with Steph that I want to share. It turns out that during one of her attempts to re-enter our lives, she showed up at my apartment unannounced. I don't know how she found out where we lived, but there she was. I wasn't home at the time, but Paul was. When Steph knocked on the door, Paul didn't open it, but he immediately called me to inform me about her visit. I decided to head home right away. When I arrived, Steph was trying to convince Paul to let her in, but he firmly refused. I confronted Steph and reminded her of her past abandonment. I told her she had no right to show up out of the blue and expect to be welcomed after everything she had done. Steph tried to apologize and offer excuses, but I'd had enough. That's when I remembered all the times Steph had humiliated and belittled me, all the times she made me feel small and insignificant. I realized it was time to put an end to her interference in our lives. I made a decision. I called the police and reported Steph. When they arrived, I explained the situation and showed them all the documents proving my legal custody of Paul. The officers spoke to Steph and warned her about the legal consequences of her actions. Steph wasn't happy about that, and she started insulting me. In the end, the police took her away. I'm not sure if she was detained or just removed from the premises, but I hope she never comes back. If she does, I'll take legal action. I should also mention that while she was at my door, she brought up my father's house, claiming she was entitled to money from the sale because she had been his wife. I found it laughable because she abandoned him when he was dying, so no, she won't be receiving anything from that sale. At that moment, I wanted to slap her across the face because she reminded me of how she had treated us all those years ago, but I didn't want to do it in front of Paul or escalate the conflict even further. Still, I hope she doesn't tempt me again, as I'm definitely getting tired of her. I know some of you will say I should get the restraining order right away, but if I did, I'd lose the chance to get a bit of revenge on her. Update 4. As expected, Steph's visit didn't end with the police. Luckily, Paul was at a friend's house, so this time we were alone. As many of you mentioned in previous comments, it was clear that the only reason Steph came was for the money from the sale of my father's house. This led to a heated conversation. And when she said that I was just as crazy as my mother and that my father got cancer because he had to take care of me since I was such a bad daughter, I just saw red. As they say, I snapped. I slapped her. She was standing in the doorway with one foot inside, so after I slapped her, I pushed her outside and slammed the door shut. Now, I've contacted a lawyer, and we're filing for a restraining order. I don't know if the slap will help with the process, but it felt so good.